Okay, Iztok, I want to welcome you to the Meacham Conversations.
Well, thank you.
And I thought we might begin by having you read a poem.
Well, let's have one. Stone. When I'm deciding about the world, I build houses. And when I'm deciding about the breath, I write poems. Poems are rivers with no banks. When they are sliding, fate whispers into the trail. Passion feeds itself on the stars, which out of the night silently grow into stone. A river is undulating before dark, and as it sinks, it evaporates level by level. A blossom is left by itself. The wind rages through the window.
Thank you very much. What's interesting about that poem is the way the language works. You have two basic metaphors, it seems. One is you move from the stone to the stars, which is a vertical kind of movement. And the other you have the river and the wind, especially the river that goes beyond its banks and exceeds out. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see the language in that poem and in your poems in general, how they work.
One of basic conception or ideas about world that we have is space-time thing. So one of the basic frameworks of every language is actually this conception about space-time. So we always position ourselves within these two dimensions. And poetry, in a way, introducing language as a third dimension to the world, of course, plays a very important role in this living experience, so to say. Now, for me, it's very different when I refer to these space-time categories or dimensions in one language, as another thing when I do that same thing in another language. And it's then very interesting how one should somehow transfer oneself from one reality of one language into the reality of another language. And I think poetry is that universal medium that actually enables you to do this transportation or transgression or transcending, let's say, from one language into another and be, let's say, a planetary being.
Do you find that because I know like many poets, you've traveled a lot around the world, do you find that your knowledge of one language influences your knowledge of and your use of Slovene? For instance, when you go to Japan or when you go to India, and you have to use that language, of course, or Pakistan and Afghanistan, and you use that language and then you come back and you pick up certain metaphors and ideas. Does that sense of their languages influence your use of Slovene, your special use of Slovene in your poem?
I think it's even more than just picking, let's say, some metaphors or some ideas from another language. I think that through another language you learn a different world, a different universe. So now when you come back and you are back to your own language, what you do actually, you introduce that other universe into your own language and you change your own language. You develop your own language, you expand your own language, and then quite often it's very interesting to see how people now finding themselves in front of this different new universe, but in their own language, how they react. And then you can realize the importance of, let's say, knowing other languages or traveling to other worlds. And somehow the role of a poet, especially a traveling poet, if we say like that, is of course that enriching of one's own language and make it universal. You know, this way Slovenian language becomes universal. And on the other hand, of course, when you travel to that other world, you also enrich this other world with your Slovenian, let's say, ideas or comprehension of the world.
So in some ways, and it also has a social and political role. We just come from this conference on political poetry in Slovenia, and especially with the centered around the poet Kosovel, but Juri Detela and many other poets. So you're really talking about also a social and political function for poetry.
Yes, like, let's say, poetry is, let's say, the essence of language, and language is the essence of society, because society is through communication, and communication is through language. And so if poetry really transcends, let's say, the everyday situation and gets to the core of what language does to people as social beings, then it means that the role of poetry is political in this particular way. Not political in a sense, some kind of power play, you know, fighting for the dominance or something. No, but through poetry and through language, you can establish social and political dimensions to this one particular society that you're part of. So there is a very important and very powerful tool that you recognize through poetry. And because sometimes you just change a word, let's say in a poem, and that suddenly is a different situation. And that's why we talk, let's say, about romantic poets, you know, revolutionizing their own societies, if you want. And then we talk about modernistic poets and the avant-garde poets and so on. So that is all political, but in this different sense of the world, establishing the society, establishing the contemporary world. And of course, with this visionary approaches also to build up future words.
Yeah, and we've talked sometimes about the notion of the poet being at the margins and the periphery, and that I think what you're saying is that the implication is that as the poet would move more towards the center, he would become more of the ordinary language. And so in order to almost critique it and to add these other influences and these other visions, basically, would be to always be at the margins, at the edge somehow.
Now, what do we understand as margin, as margins? You know, it means that poet is somebody who is sort of standing out from, let's say, a common level or common ground. The same way, you know, an electrical engineer in a hydropower station taking care of a dynamo in there, you know, is marginalized from the core of the society, but the society could not go without this electricity. Yeah. So, because a poet is a highly specialized professional, of course he's marginalized from, let's say, the common communication discussion. And though he's the one who actually enables that, because later on people pick up his ideas, his metaphors, his ways how to solve, let's say, existential situations and social and political situations you want, and of course apply those to their everyday common experience, while they don't dedicate all their awareness and all their time to doing these things. While poet does that. So he is marginalized in this sense. He's not pushed away, you know, it's a kind of decision of he himself that he does that. And he knows and he understands why he's there on the margins of the society. Not because he's some kind of neglected or outcast figure, but because he's just the opposite. He is in the core of everything. So that's why, you know, people consider that there's something strange with him, but he knows it.
I notice also when you have traveled, you also pick the countries that are more to the margin. I mean, you've been to Afghanistan. When you go to Japan, for instance, you went to up into the mountains to the temple, and so in many ways you gravitate that way, and your poems sort of do that too. And even the earlier book, Mr. Day, Mr. Today is always marginalizing himself from himself, so that he can pull away from himself to critique himself. That seems to be a common gesture in your poem.
Yes, but this is this same position that I described already. You know, this distancing yourself also enables you to put yourself into a new context, let's say, The only way how to find new universes is to go away from your own universe and then to enter this other universe. And of course, once you've done that, it's easy to understand and to see that, but there's a difference in between a reader and an author. In front of author is an empty page, you know, which needs to be filled up with words, ideas, concepts, metaphors, and so on and so on. While the reader himself, he has that in front of him. He just have to, let's say, decipher what that is all about. So, and finding new universes, finding new ways, finding how to expand, you know, that symbolic universe that is your playground and your workplace, your workshop, you know, that means that you have to somehow distance yourself from your everyday experience. Yeah? And that is not this easy always, you know. Of course, it's easy later on to recognize that fact, but to do it, it requires a lot of creativity, so to say, you know, and daring and courage, even if you want, and sometimes courage to lose, you know, some privileged position or some human situation that is important to you.
Well, thank you very much.
Well,
okay.
You're welcome. Thank you.